Good morning and welcome to the Dali Museum. We're very pleased to have all of you with us today. And there is overflow seating next door if anybody would like a more comfortable seat, but this is where you can drink coffee, which is a good thing. So welcome to Coffee with a Curator. I'm Peter Tush, the Curator of Education. Pleased to have all of you with us today. We want to thank our program sponsors. First, Cafe Gala, who provide the refreshment for this event, and then also the City of St. Pete, who underwrote our conversations at the Dali Museum, so all of our free public programming. Also want to mention, once again, please silence your cell phone. Take a moment. It's not going to interrupt anybody now to silence it, but in a few minutes it could be very problematic. And it was suggested that perhaps we show a calendar while I go through the calendar, and this month we absolutely have a number of things that if you're not seeing this on the screen, you probably will forget every one of them. But there's some sensational things we're doing. We'll want you to be aware of them. First, March 29th, Thursday next week, we have chess games chess day at the Dali. We have 3 separate events tied in with this. And during the Duchamp Dali exhibition, we are doing game nights. This turned into a game day and night event. The first thing is we're starting off the day with a sort of pseudo coffee with a curator minus the coffee, but it's a free talk at 10:30 on Thursday morning, Duchamp and the Art of Chess. So if any of you have even the slightest interest in chess, we have Jennifer Shahad, who is the Women's Grand Master of Chess in the United States. She has done this talk a number of times at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She's going to share her insights into Duchamp and his fascination with chess. That will then lead to her performance of hula chess. She is a master of playing hula hoop while playing a chess game. So it must be seen to be appreciated. There's actually a YouTube video. If you're curious what that looks like, go on YouTube and you will definitely make sure you're here for this. The rest of the day, we're going to have 2 things happening. We'll have spontaneous chess games, or there'll be chessboards you can just join and play somebody. And we'll also have 2 masters performing or playing a game of chess throughout the day. So there'll be opportunities to come see that. And then at 6 o'clock in the evening, we have surreal simul chess games. And Jennifer will be one of 3 masters who are going to be playing this. We are able to have up to 60 players, and each one of the masters will play up to 20 players simultaneously. So it's going to be really interesting. Definitely, if that sounds intriguing, we hope you'll come. If you're a chess player, we hope you will sign up. It's only $5, and we would love to have 60 people playing. Coffee with a Curator next month is going to be Margot Hammond, and next month is only 2 weeks away, March 4th, because of the Grand Prix. We got delayed on today's coffee. She's going to be talking about surrealism, crime, and the Black Dahlia murder. So definitely an intriguing subject. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that. And then in May, this is still under progress, but our director was going to do the talk. He's not available. So we're going to have a panel of Dali staff talking about some of the issues that will probably come up in today's talk, Dali, Duchamp, and sexual politics. Poetry event, Poetry at the Dali, hosted by Helen Pruitt-Wallace, is April 8th, Thursday. And then last but not least, we are doing a Duchamp assisted ready-made workshop with Steve Beveridge, local artist. He's going to be doing a talk on Saturday, April 14th, followed by several sessions at the Morian Arts Center focusing on the assisted ready-made. So there's some small flyers about that. You might want to grab one on your way out. It should be actually really interesting. But today we're here for Katherine Brion. Professor Brion is doing a presentation on questioning gender with Duchamp. And just very briefly, she's the assistant professor of art history and an affiliate of the Gender Studies program at New College in Sarasota. She earned her PhD in 2014 at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor on decorative painting and politics in France from 1890 to 1914. Prior to that, in 2004, she took a special diploma in museum studies from the Louvre. And in 2002, she earned her BA at the University of California, Berkeley, double major in art history, and her French honors thesis on Charles Marville. So with that, please join me in welcoming Katie Brion.
All right, well, I'll get started because that's just my title slide. So we can wait a moment for the artworks. So I wanted to begin by thanking the Dali Museum, and in particular Peter Tusch, for inviting me to return to speak again about sort of gender issues and art. Last year I spoke about Frida Kahlo, and so today I'm talking about Marcel Duchamp. And there's a certain amount of overlap between these two artists, though Duchamp first made his mark with Cubism and especially with the International Dada movement. Both he and Kahlo were associated with and exhibited with the Surrealists, even if neither sort of fully embraced this identity. And Duchamp had supposedly given up artistic activity in favor of playing chess. And when Kahlo traveled to Paris in 1939, only to be disappointed by André Breton's failure to prepare a planned exhibition of her work, she traveled a long way, Duchamp was able to offer her some support in this area. But more important than this specific point of contact is it's the wider historical moment that was shared by the artists. And thank you. And as I noted last year in talking about Kahlo, the early 20th century artistic avant-garde prided itself in shaking off the constraints of middle-class customs and morality. And in many instances, they targeted traditional gender roles. They were encouraged to do so by wider societal changes, and hopefully, yes, it works this time. The idea in particular of the new woman, an independent working professional no longer constrained by familial ties and domestic duties. And this idea occupied the European and American imagination as both a source of desire and anxiety. This new ideal inspired the androgynous fashions of the flapper and Coco Chanel, who you can see on the right, but it was also seen by many as a threat to society. New women were blamed, for example, for the falling birth rate. In other words, the distinction between biological sex and gender, and by gender I mean the meanings and expectations that society attributes to, but which are not inherent to the sex with which one is born. So there was becoming the differences between those two categories, between sex and gender, was becoming increasingly apparent to the delight of some and to the horror of others. It is thus no surprise that artists would want to explore this and other modern challenges to gender norms. Last time I was here, I showed, for example, images of, the American artist Georgia O'Keeffe at the 1907 New York Art Students League costume ball, in which she and several other students dressed in the attire of the opposite sex, as well as images demonstrating the artist's adoption of a masculine or androgynous form of dress as an integral and regular part of her wardrobe. Fellow American artist and friend of Duchamp, Florine Stettheimer, did the same. And in this painting, you can see her at the left, she depicts herself in a black suit and bright red heels, high heels, nonetheless. With these and many other artists, experimentation with gender and sexuality fed into artistic experimentation and vice versa. When it comes to Duchamp, these forms of experimentation were particularly aligned. Duchamp is perhaps best known for having challenged the very notion of art by inventing the notion of the ready-made and presenting an inverted urinal as a work of art, a challenge which is summed up so well by the poster for the current exhibition. Even as Duchamp was, in the words of André Breton and Paul Edouard's abridged dictionary of surrealism, promoting ordinary objects to the dignity of an art object by the simple choice of the artist, he was also engaged in an ongoing challenge to gender norms via his artworks and his self-presentation. Fountain itself is a case in point, for it literally overturned an item associated with the male sex. Many have noted that if it were to be used for its original purpose in its altered, inverted form, the user would find their urine pouring back at them, splattering their feet. Yeah, that's a nice image for you. Others have highlighted the way the inverted urinal evokes female attributes like the uterus, and scholar William Canfield even argued that the lighting of Fountain in Stieglitz's photograph was calculated to produce an image of the Virgin Mary in the object's porcelain concavity. So, don't know if you can see this, but you can sort of see the veil, right? If you see the light, the lit up part is the sort of face, and the dark shadow is the veil. Or Buddha. Others have seen the Buddha. The great religions. Duchamp, in fact, indicated in an early letter that he had submitted the object to the Society of Independent Artists on behalf of a quote-unquote female friend. It has been suggested that Fountain may not have been Duchamp's idea at all, but rather that of his extravagant fellow Dadaist, Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. very complicated name, thanks in part to Duchamp's letter and in part to ready-made works like The Baroness's God, that's one theory, or that she was at the very least a strong source of inspiration and perhaps even of materials like the urinal that became fountain. This is the more accepted view, I think. Others see in Duchamp's female friend a possible early reference to his elaboration of a feminine alter ego he named Rrose Sélavy, the artist's most evident challenge to gender norms. The name first appeared on the 1920 Fresh Widow, so he loved wordplays, marked copyright Rrose Sélavy, if you can see it very on the lower, just beneath on the kind of base of the window. And eventually gained an additional, this alter ego name, eventually gained an additional R when, for example, Duchamp signed Francis Picabier's Cacodilic Eye of 1921 with both names. It's very hard to see, but I saw it. I zoomed in on a sort of black and white image, and you can find it. It's just hard to see in reproduction. When pronounced, the double R meant that the name doubled as the phrase "love that is life." Duchamp was as I noted, Duchamp was very fond of puns and other forms of wordplay, and the double R playfully referred to the double meanings brought forth by those puns, as well as the artist's doubling of himself as Rose or Rrose. Henceforth, Duchamp signed numerous works and even personal correspondence as or along with Rrose Sélavy. The former ranged from these, here, you can see it a little bit better. I had this image so I could show you where, if you see the circled area with the kind of two floating heads, you can just make out Rrose Sélavy, which Duchamp had associated with a play on Picabier's name. So in terms of these signatures, the former range from these playful Rrose Sélavy luggage tags that you can see on the left to the series of miniature museums known as the boîte en valise, or the box in a valise, begun in the late 1930s and which consisted of reproductions and miniature replicas. And in the deluxe editions, one original, very much in quotations, of the artist's work. Inside the lid, the box, and perhaps the entire oeuvre that it represented, was declared to be, quote, of or by Marcel Duchamp or Rrose Sélavy. Duchamp's engagement with the feminine was not limited to this alter ego either. To cite just one example, when selecting photographs to represent the surrealists in the catalog for the 1942 First Surrealist Papers exhibition, which was meant to introduce surrealism, then in exile from Europe thanks to World War II, to the American public, Duchamp chose to represent himself through the image of a female sharecropper taken from a New Deal photograph by Ben Shahn. So I think he must have seen, the resemblance is uncanny. But he was the only one that he represented sort of transgressing gender norms. The others were given sort of male or female images to represent themselves. Nevertheless, Rrose Sélavy was the most enduring of Duchamp's feminine personas, and Duchamp gave this alter ego more concrete embodied form in a few key instances. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see him photographed in this role by his friend and fellow artist, well, actually on both sides of the screen, by his friend and fellow artist, Man Ray. It has been suggested, at least for the image on the left-hand side, that the artist manipulated the negative to soften either Duchamp or Man Ray, or both, to soften Duchamp's face and eyes, and that a female friend may have provided the arms and hands visible in the photograph. Though many contemporaries noted the elegance and refinement of Duchamp's own physiognomy and physique, so it's probably just him. Regardless, Duchamp and Man Ray clearly did their best to enhance the sultry effect of the former's come-hither gaze, producing a vision of femininity in keeping with that displayed in women's magazines of the period. While delving into issues of Ladies' Home Journal and Vanity Fair of around the same period for a student exercise, I was struck by the parallels between the image of Rrose Sélavy in the cloche hat and this photograph of the actress Anne Andrews in Vanity Fair, so the one that you can see in the journal page the most to the left. Both look out at the audience from a face presented in three-quarter profile, pressing a fur stole to their features, and have the sort of heavily made up dark eyes. This connection between Duchamp's embodiment of Rrose Sélavy and mass cultural publications and advertising is confirmed by the artist's use of one of Man Ray's images in a later work. This ready-made, consisting of a Ray-labeled perfume bottle with the title Belle Hélène Eau de Voilette, which was a sort of wordplay on typical perfume labels and roughly translates as beautiful breath, veiled water. So make of that what you will. You can see the vignette image of Duchamp Rrose Sélavy above the label Belle Hélène, and Rrose Sélavy's initials on the label and her name written on the case along with the date, 1921. Duchamp then used an image of the relabeled perfume bottle on the cover of the single-issue magazine New York Dada, which parodied and subverted the kind of advertising ploys and imagery aimed at women. Next to this cover, I'm showing you a cartoon displaying figures from the New York iteration of Dada, and that word meant, among other possibilities, nonsense, suggesting the movement's playful, anarchic character. You can see Duchamp bent over a chessboard, making a move. Man Ray's attention is also on the game. He, like Duchamp, has a pipe clutched in his teeth. Katherine Brion, a key benefactor and collector of Duchamp's work, is shown here as well. You can see her in the kind of plumed hat. It is interesting to note that the lines that serve to delineate her cheeks and nose also read, I think, as a mustache. Intentionally or not, this recalls Duchamp's earlier Dada gesture, in which he placed a mustache and a goatee on a reproduction of the Mona Lisa, providing the work with the provocative title Elle a chaud au cul. Pronouncing the letters together in French produces a sentence that is often translated as she has a hot ass, but should really be translated as she has the hots or she's horny. So either way, it's a provocation. Francis Picabia later reproduced a version of this work above his Dada manifesto for the March 1920 issue of his 391 magazine. The manifesto critiqued the art world in general and Cubism in particular, presenting Dada as an antidote. Its final sentences read, quote, Dada for its part wants nothing, nothing, nothing. It does something so that the public will say, we understand nothing, nothing, nothing. The Dadaists are nothing, 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 and they will surely come to nothing, nothing, nothing. So this gives you something of the flavor of the Dada movement, at least in New York, and in this context, Elle a chaud au cul serves even more clearly as a shot in the eye of the bourgeois public, whether they appreciated grand master works like those of Leonardo, or the more recent innovations of Cubism that Duchamp had rejected as yet another example of a tiresome retinal, that was the term he often used, art. As was so often the case with Duchamp, the artist had aligned this challenge with the transgression of gender norms, rendering Mona Lisa, still gendered as she by the title, the elle doubles as she in French, with masculine facial hair. Duchamp engaged in a similar masculinization of the feminine in the context of the International Exhibition of Surrealism, which took place in Paris in 1938. In addition to furnishing many of the exhibition's unusual curatorial strategies, including the coal sacks, sometimes specified as 1,200, hanging from the ceiling of the main room of the exhibition, as evoked, in fact, in the entrance to the Dali-Duchamp exhibition. And Duchamp also installed a female mannequin wearing his clothes, at least from the waist up, and the shoes, and signed or identified as a Rrose Sélavy. It should be noted that this was also the exhibition that featured Dali's rainy taxi in the courtyard, as well as the first version of his lobster telephone. And so here you can see to the left a view of the main room of the exhibition with the hanging coal sacks, which were filled with paper but reportedly dropped coal dust on the visitors, a vestige of their prior function. And the electric brazier visible at the bottom of the photo purposefully did not provide much light. So individual visitors were provided with flashlights in order to better view the works, although they kind of disappeared as the opening night continued, leaving people in the dark. So this was a sort of a literal manifestation of Duchamp's notion that it was viewers that made the work, right? So the work sort of appears, it manifests themselves as they approach with their flashlights. Duchamp's mannequin, of which you have two views here in context, was placed in the corridor that led into this main gallery with all the hanging coal sacks, fourth in a row of 16 mannequins decorated by participants in the exhibition, largely surrealist artists or writers. Only one of these was decorated by a woman, Sonia Mosset, and this one is visible to the left of Duchamp's mannequin. Compared to the other mannequins, including the neighboring figure by André Masson, with its wild flame-like curls, encaged head, mouth muzzled with a pansy, and plumed pubis, Duchamp's was fairly restrained. The mannequin appears as a rather dapper individual in her masculine clothing, which contrasts with the feminine makeup and soft curls of her coiffure. She could serve as a model image of the new woman, were it not for her lack of pants, a lack accentuated by the fact that she does, in contrast, wear shoes. And it was here, on the mannequin's lower abdomen, that Duchamp left his mark, signing as Rrose Sélavy, and leading many to identify the figure as Rrose Sélavy. Yes, yeah, you've got the crotch shot right there. So hopefully you can see it. I had to zoom in and crop it, the detail in this photograph. But the photographer was clearly already sort of fascinated by this below-the-belt view. So this kind of gesture impeding a securely feminist reading of Duchamp's gender transgressions is typical of the artist and his Dada and Surrealist colleagues. Is he affirming the association of gender with biological sex by aligning this feminine name with the mannequin's female, though sexless pubis, thereby undermining the subversive character of his alternation between and combination of masculine and feminine personas? Or is he mocking that association in the context of his gender transgressions? Is Rrose Sélavy another of Duchamp's objects, or a true alter ego, the independent subject that the signature suggests? It was as if Duchamp wanted to make sure that we could never quite be sure. That's very, very much his sort of playful way of working with artworks or non-artworks. While Amelia Jones has highlighted the feminist possibilities of Duchamp's troubling of gender binaries, David Hopkins has emphasized the quote-unquote laddish character of Duchamp's erotic humor. Duchamp's self-presentation was nevertheless far from laddish by most accounts. Several scholars have highlighted the way in which the figure of the dandy fits the artist like a glove. Promoted by the 19th century poet Charles Baudelaire as a quintessential product of modern life, the dandy designated someone who was androgynous, coolly elegant, detached but intensely aware of self and situation. Duchamp was described by many as charming, elegant, refined, sensitive, and sympathetic. Terms more often used to describe women, and many of the women in his circle noted his beauty and attraction. Amelia Jones has concluded that, quote, Duchamp's ambiguously sexed identity in fact connotes more sexuality, both masculine and feminine aspects of seductiveness. We can get a sense of this seductiveness in a portrait of Duchamp painted by Florine Stettheimer, known for her own transgressions of conventional behavior and dress, as you saw in the early painting and sort of portrait of herself at the beginning of my talk. In contrast to Man Ray's photograph of Duchamp as Rrose Sélavy, Stettheimer's work is a double portrait depicting Duchamp in both his masculine and feminine roles, suggesting that these identities are distinct, yet contemporaneous. The male presenting Duchamp delicately and somewhat nonchalantly holds a kind of crank that manipulates a sprung pedestal, a perch bearing the name and the more sinuous figure of Rrose Sélavy. Also, in contrast to Man Ray's portrait, Stettheimer has not obscured all but the artist's face with blatant accoutrements of femininity like the fur stole, low-brimmed hats, and jewels or pearls bedecking the hands or neck, features that suggest that Duchamp must be hidden or disguised in order to masquerade as a woman. So I would say this is characteristic of Man Ray's photographic portrait. If anything, in contrast, Stettheimer's Rrose Sélavy looks more simply dressed than her male counterpart, though her hair, not a bit longer, and dress have certainly taken on more vivid hues, and her pose is more curved and languorous than that of Duchamp, with his upright torso and squared shoulders. If the masculine Duchamp is ostensibly the one in control, a Rrose Sélavy is the one that is raised high and seems ready to hold forth. The portrait indicates that the poles of Duchamp's masculinity and femininity are not so far apart, each present and ready to come to the fore at any moment. Other depictions by Stettheimer suggest the same thing. So, for example, in the earlier Sunday Afternoon in the Country, if you look on the sort of lower left-hand corner, you can see the photographer Edward Steichen trying to coax a smile or at least a look from the seemingly reticent red-haired Duchamp, whose figure has much in common with Rrose Sélavy. A more severe Duchamp, though equally introspective, appears in the portrait to your right, though both display delicate, refined features. So it's as if rather than fearing the American image of the effete artist satirized by Maxfield Parrish in 1909, so you can see that on the left, artist sex male, but you can see there's certain characteristics trying to emphasize a kind of weak instead of sort of strong figure. Duchamp embraced the androgynous ambiguity of the dandy. So earlier in the talk, I evoked the distinction between biological sex and gender. So far, I have been discussing the various ways in which Duchamp seems to have subscribed to and even embodied a vision of gender as malleable and fluid. Another way of expressing this is to say that Duchamp conceived of gender as performative, or at least pointed in that direction. And scholar Judith Butler is a key figure in the elucidation of the performative character of gender. In 1988, she wrote that, quote, "Gender is in no way a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts proceed. Rather, it is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. Further, gender is instituted through the stylization of the body and, hence, must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and enactments of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. This is not to say that gender is as easily transformed as a costume or a role in a theater performance. Butler insists that the performance of gender identity is, quote, compelled by social sanction and taboo. In other words, there are serious consequences, both explicit and internalized, to the failure or refusal to adequately perform to gender norms. Nevertheless, Butler also points to the emancipatory potential of gender's performative character, which opens up the possibility of a different sort of repeating, and therefore the possibility of contesting gender norms in order to, quote unquote, expand the cultural field, expand the possibilities of actions. Duchamp's ongoing performance of acts that fell outside the bounds of accepted masculine norms, whether his reiteration of Rrose Sélavy's feminine presence via her many signatures and punctuated by her more infrequent embodiment, or Duchamp's dandified bearing and appearance, represents exactly this kind of contestation and expansion, and his work has certainly been understood in these terms by a number of subsequent artists. But before going on to discuss some of these artists, I want to address some of the ways in which Duchamp suggested that sex itself might be malleable. In order to do so, I must present to you, albeit in a somewhat cursory fashion, the artist's two most complex works. His bride's first, his bride stripped bare by her bachelor's even, also known as the large glass, and Étant donné, which I'll be talking about shortly, which is translated along with its subtitle as Given, 1, the waterfall, 2, the illuminating gas. Though much more could be said about its iconography, the large glass has been summed up as, quote, the endlessly deferred attempt of 9 bachelors, the Malick molds that you can see suspended, well, you might be able to see it better in the annotated version. Here are the bachelors, sort of suspended here. And to bring an abstractly represented bride to a state of blossoming. And so the bride is sort of here in the upper register, and there are sort of independent paintings where Duchamp had kind of elaborated this bride figure. Divided by a barrier in the middle, the bachelors and the bride remain suspended, both literally and figuratively, in a state of arousal in their separate realms. And these all come from sort of Duchamp's own descriptions. To briefly return to the subject of Duchamp's performance of ambiguous or alternating gender roles, note that in a sketch from the artist's Green Box, which was a predecessor to the Boîte en Valise that contained notes and materials related to his creation of the large glass, scholars have identified the abbreviated labeling of the female figure of the mariée, the bride, and the male or malic célibataire, the bachelors, with the two parts of Duchamp's given name, Marcel. So you can see marié, Marcel, and célibataire, C-E-L, right? So the kind of upper, you have to read it into it. So these suggested the artist's association with both the female and the male realms of the large glass. He's sort of inscribing his name, right, in both sections. While Duchamp described the bachelor's realm as our own three-dimensional realm, as suggested by the three-dimensional schematic character of the elements that occupy it, the realm of the bride was identified as a higher fourth dimension that we are unable to fully perceive, hence its flatness. Via a series of complex maneuvers, the illuminating gas produced by the bachelor's arousal is funneled through the various neighboring devices until it can be shot in liquid form into the realm of the bride. Duchamp used matchsticks dipped in paint shot from a toy cannon to stand in for these shots, which you can, again, if you can see in the sort of annotated version at the top, the sort of small little sort of pin, almost looks like pin pricks. But none of these got anywhere near their target, the square, which was the square openings in the billowing cloud form adjacent to the bride. Many scholars have highlighted the relationship between this work, The Large Glass, and the later Étant donné, whose title comes from a note in the large glass's accompanying green box and contains elements, the waterfall and the illuminating gas, which you'll see in the next image, that were conceptualized but not visualized in the earlier work. A work that more than most suffers in representation, Étant donné consists of a meticulously constructed scene that can only be viewed through the two peepholes provided in this door that you can see here. You can kind of see a sort of lighter area that people's faces rubbing against it to sort of look through the peephole have worn down the door a bit in that area. Looking through these peepholes, and this is installed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, like in a kind of alcove neighboring where the original large glass is installed. So looking through, the viewer sees a disturbing three-dimensional scene, and I'm sorry, it's very small in this image. The torso of a woman lying on a bed of twigs as if dead, yet holding aloft an old-fashioned lamp, with an incongruously cheerful picture postcard landscape visible in the distance, in which the waterfall of the title flows down into the lake. And there's actually a motor that keeps the waterfall flowing and kind of lit up. Jean-François Lyotard has identified the figure as the stripped bride, this sort of nude figure in this installation. Perhaps she has fallen post-consummation to the earthly realm with her lamp lit by the bachelor's illuminating gas. What does this work with its female figure exposed to the viewer voyeur's gaze say about sex and gender? Certainly many, including myself, have found it disturbing, a scene of visual and physical violation, especially given the strange configuration of the figure's vulva, which suggests a gash rather than the female external genital organs. Yet it is precisely this feature that has led Amelia Jones to identify a critical rather than predatory impulse in this work, for it simultaneously makes the viewer self-conscious of their own voyeurism, thanks to its placement in the museum, where you can be caught looking very easily, and prevents the ultimate satisfaction of that voyeurism. Rather than presenting an orifice to be visually penetrated, the figure presents a site of apparent castration, thereby invoking the male castration anxiety that, according to Freud, haunted male sexual identification. In this interpretation, Duchamp's work is evocative of René Green's critique of the dehumanizing display of women of color in works like Scene, using text, sound, and a platform to evoke the early 19th and early 20th century performances of Sarah Bartman as the Hottentot Venus and Josephine Baker, as well as the sale of slaves, Green invites the viewer onto the platform, where they suddenly find themselves spotlit against a scrim and subject to a pair of motorized spectacled eyes that look up, winking through a hole in the floor. So, expecting to be the voyeur, the viewer voyeur, you become the subject of the gaze. So, but to return to Duchamp, there's another interesting facet of étant donné to be excavated, its relationship to what are known as the artist's erotic or sexual objects, which were created during the period Duchamp was elaborating the installation. These consist of, and you can see these in the exhibition, the female fig leaf, the objet d'art, translated as dart object, but also a pun in French on the word for artwork, and wedge of chastity. The first two objects, visible at the bottom of my slide, have respectively female, so female on the right-hand side, and male connotations, yet these identifications are subtly undermined in a variety of ways. Even if the initial form of female fig leaf was in fact modeled by hand, it nevertheless appears to be a cast taken from between the legs of the figure from étant donné. It therefore serves as an impression of an absent or indeterminately modeled vulva rather than an evocation of a securely sexed body. Moreover, the object's raised ridge culminates into a form that is vaguely phallic and yet not quite. As for the objet d'art, or the object dart, dart object, whichever way you translated it, it is very clearly phallic, but it is also flaccid, and turns out to have been the result of a fragment of the armature used to make the breast of the nude figure from étant donné. As Amelia Jones has highlighted, it thus, quote, holds an ironic position as signifier not of phallic plenitude, but of formless lack. Here, the penis is simply not breast. Duchamp gave the last of the three objects, wedge of chastity, to his second wife, Teenie Duchamp, as a wedding present. An ironic gesture or a kind of bow, sort of hard to tell. They reportedly traveled with it rather as if it were a wedding ring, so perhaps it was serving that purpose. It consists of two elements, and you can see them taken apart in the exhibition, which I encourage you to do. A wedge of galvanized plaster tightly fitted into a piece of dental plastic. The conjunction, again, of sort of two indeterminately sexed forms. And the visual malleability of all these objects suggests an overturning of the traditional conception of sex and gender. Rather than biological sex guaranteeing the fixity of gender, the notion challenged by gender studies' emphasis on performativity, the ambiguity of gender has subverted the supposed fixity of sex. So, I'm going to take a drink of water first because the large glass is and étant donné is very tiring to the voice. But so I've talked to you at length about the ways in which Duchamp's artistic practice and persona work to question and challenge gender norms. I will now turn to its impact on a selection of other artists. The sort of impact of Duchamp on other artists is very vast, especially in the sort of cerebral character of his art, which influenced notably the conceptual art movement. But it goes much deeper than that in terms of, and notably involves a number of artists exploring sort of embodiment, the body, and issues of sort of sex and gender. Although Duchamp was reputedly withdrawn from, or at least indifferent to, the art world after World War II, he carefully curated his artistic legacy in images with works like Boîte en valise, or the promotion of a monograph on himself by Robert Lebel in the later 1950s. All of this activity brought Duchamp to the attention of a new generation of artists who saw in him and his work a new model of artistic practice, or non-artistic practice, Duchamp might have said. Ed Ruscha, a California pop artist known for deadpan imagery of swimming pools and gas stations, as well as a lot of wordplay, described Duchamp as a refreshing alternative to the, quote, chain-smoking macho Pollock. Duchamp was a hero, a little jewel in the darkness. And so Duchamp was, of course, referring to Jackson Pollock, the abstract expressionist pictured at the center of this group of artists, key figures in what came to be known as the New York School, at a time when the capital of the art world was shifting from Paris to New York. Surrounded by a group of largely male colleagues, this image of Pollock certainly lives up to Rouché's characterization, with his cigarette in hand, furrowed brow, and brooding look, which I know is a little hard to see in this image, but it's definitely brooding. He was becoming known for his large-scale abstract paintings, which he painted on the ground before hanging on the wall, sometimes leaving marks of his own hand or his cigarette butts, along with the expressive gestural swaths of paint. And here I'm showing you Pollock's celebrated Autumn Rhythm, and here is another work, 1A, along with a detail here of the artist's handprint on the surface of the canvas. This manner of working soon to be characterized as action painting, thanks to the way Pollock circled his canvases as he flicked or dripped paint upon them. You can see an image of that here. Became a key element in the emphatically masculine framing of the artist and his work. So here's another image by Hans Nemeth of the artist moving, right? I mean, you can see the motion and the blur of the photograph. But here you see Pollock in an earlier coverage from Life magazine, displayed with unapologetically crossed arms, spattered clothing, and cigarette in mouth over the question, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? You can see why this might get a little tiresome, especially for a slightly younger generation of artists trying to make their own way in the art world. The dry-humored Duchamp, as you might imagine, was skeptical of abstract expressionism's emphatically retinal and emotional character, even if he had a hand in helping Pollock to obtain a key early commission from Peggy Guggenheim. Both Amelia Jones and David Hopkins have identified the artist's paysage fautif, or wayward landscape, as a possible commentary on the alignment of a macho masculine genius with abstract expressionism's painterly gestures, or indeed with artistic production in general. One of the original works included in the deluxe versions of Duchamp's Boîte en Valise, this purported landscape consists of an irregularly shaped pool of semen, which may be Duchamp's own. It was actually analyzed by the FBI, I noticed, in order to determine what was this substance. So I'm not sure what they made of this task, but so this irregularly shaped pool full of phallic blobs on a black silk backdrop. It is hard not to see this painterly literalization of the association of artistic creativity with male potency as a send-up of both abstract expressionism and the broader gender paradigms of the art world. And though they may not have been aware of this particular work, artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns presented a similarly caustic viewpoint. So encouraged by the musician John Cage, who was a huge admirer of Duchamp and seems to have introduced him to a number of artists, Rauschenberg had created a number of works that defied abstract expressionism due to the, in this case, absence of painterly gesture with a series of monochrome, flatly painted white paintings. Or the erasure of gesture, as when Rauschenberg erased a drawing by abstract expressionist William de Kooning. He asked de Kooning if he could do this, and apparently de Kooning gave him a drawing that was particularly hard to erase, very sort of very ingrained and sort of oiled into the paper, but he nevertheless managed to erase quite a bit of it. Or by disassociating the gesture with the hand of the painter, from the hand of the painter, as with this automobile tire print. He soon began to reincorporate the painterly gesture into his work, but undermined its expressive connotation by combining it with ready-made objects or images. And there, of course, you can see Duchamp's legacy as well. In bed, the brush strokes and drips of paint suggest bodily fluids, perhaps even semen, when laid over a pillowcase, sheets, and quilt. This is not actually a bed, but it looks very much like it. It's about as yay thick, so it's not really on a mattress. And the quilt is the kind of feminine domestic creation that was definitely not admitted into modernist abstraction. Jasper John's Two Balls also poked fun at abstract expressionism and its macho rhetoric. The two balls of the title are prominently on display in a crevice opened up in a field of abstract, colorful brushwork. Their position seems tenuous. They appear to have wedged the space open, but could be crushed at any moment by the weight of the gestural field. At the same time, the field itself seems to be occluding rather than expressing something. And I would argue the sense of something private, hidden, or occluded points to another reason that the heavy-handed masculinity of abstract expressionism may have felt oppressive. Andy Warhol, who did not at all fit into this prevailing macho paradigm, noted of his swish or camp self-presentation, so i.e. a presentation that was feminized and or associated with homosexuality, quote, "I'd always had a lot of fun with that, just watching the expression on people's faces. You'd have to have seen the way all the abstract expressionist painters carried themselves and the kinds of images they cultivated to understand how shocked people were to see a painter coming on swish. I certainly wasn't a butch kind of guy by nature, but I must admit I went out of my way to play up the other extreme. The world of the abstract expressionist was very macho. The painters were all hard-driving, two-fisted types. The toughness was part of a tradition. It went with their agonized, anguished art. If not embracing, like Warhol, an overtly camp presentation, Rauschenberg and Johns were nevertheless lovers at the time of these works' creation. And their works, including Bed and Two Balls, have been examined as latent or coded expressions of their private lives and its repression in public life. You can see also, for example, Johns' work with the target and body parts that can be closed behind wooden doors. And they were, when it was acquired by a museum, parts were hidden behind doors at the museum's request. Duchamp must have provided an attractive alternative model to that of the abstract expressionists, especially given Duchamp's views of homosexuality as a normal manifestation of human sexuality. Despite the fact that Duchamp was not a member of the LGBTQ community of his time, the combination of his many homosocially oriented artistic collaborations, his frank, if esoteric, treatment of sexuality, and his troubling of gender norms made Duchamp a compelling figure for LGBTQ artists from the 1950s and beyond. But he was above all served as an inspiration for artists seeking to challenge the male-oriented art world and or binary gender norms, regardless of their sexual preferences. And here you can see the feminist artist Hannah Wilke performing in 1976 a striptease viewed through Duchamp's The Large Glass. She goes from a bachelor in masculine dress to stripped female bride and wrote of the performance and resulting footage that, quote, "I was the bride stripped bare, but also the bride as artist making the work, so that Duchamp's large glass became, all of a sudden, just a dead symbol, a prop for a moving, live woman. I stripped myself bare, but I stripped myself of the veil of woman being just the model for the man." Wilke was simultaneously negating Duchamp as a male figure of the artistic canon while exploring a potential that was, as I hope I have indicated, already embedded in the artist's own work and life. And a very different example, or similar in some ways, the male artist Vito Acconci has mined Duchamp's work in a more oblique fashion, albeit with a similar purpose of challenging the art world's masculine character. I will spare you the images of performances like Conversions or Trappings, in which the artist sought to conform his male body to a female form or dressed up and associated his penis with femininity and childhood. But here I am showing you a work related to Acconci's famous Seed Bed, a repeated performance in which Acconci masturbated under a constructed ramp while visitors walked above him. Yes, he spoke his fantasies, both hetero and homosexual, into a microphone so that they were conveyed to the visitors through speakers installed in the corners of the gallery. The separation of the realms above and below the ramp, where a masturbating bachelor resides, evokes Duchamp's large glass. And its own, Duchamp talked about its onanistic character of the bachelor realm. Though this performance could certainly be aligned with the laddish tradition, so I don't know if we would translate that, it's a sort of British term, I don't know if that would be locker room tradition, identified by David Hopkins, Amelia Jones sees this as another example of a work in which the exaggerated performance of masculinity and male sexuality, not to mention Akanchi's inclusive playing out of fantasy, ultimately destabilizes what it performs. Nevertheless, it is hard to see such a work which so clearly dovetails with experiences of sexual harassment going over very well today in our current moment. Not that it was meant, I think, to go over well at that time either. In the postmodernist 80s, the emphasis turned more to the performance of gender identity within the image. And somewhat more sedate works, I would say as well. Given the statement by Warhol that I read earlier in this talk, you should not be surprised that in 1981 we find the artist dressing up in feminine garb, makeup, and wigs in homage to Duchamp's Rrose Sélavy. And I'm showing you one of these images of Warhol next to another homage by Japanese artist Yasumasa Morimura. More literal than Warhol's riff on Rrose Sélavy, Morimura has also literalized Duchamp's doubling of identities visible in the two hats and the two pairs of hands. And last year I had shown this artist reworking of Frida Kahlo's The Two Fridas, which suggests the extent to which Duchamp and Kahlo have inspired artistic performances of identity and performative conceptions of identity. But another artist who works very much in this mode is Cindy Sherman, an admirer of Duchamp's performance of Rrose Sélavy, though her work echoes it less directly. And regardless of whether she puts on a feminine or masculine guise, Sherman exaggerates elements of her body via fashion, prosthetics, and or makeup in order to highlight the performative character of these particular identities, as well as of identity in general. And for one additional set of the many possible examples of artists playing with gender identity in the spirit of Duchamp, here you have Jeanine, that's very, very high up on the top of the slide, but if you can see it. Here you have Janine Antoni and Lyle Ashton Harris and Renee Cox's takes on real or imagined families that defy gender boundaries. So Antoni, up very high up on the slide on the left, has used makeup to question the gender binary presented by her own mother and father. So sometimes there's the sort of father in drag, mother in drag, and then both in drag. While Renee Cox has taken on the role of father and Lyle Ashton Harris, the mother in Harris's the child, so sort of reversing expectations for sort of sex and gender roles. So before concluding, and I think I've sort of raced through my talk, I will leave you with one final set of works, this time inspired in one way or another by Duchamp's Fountain. Yes. And here I'm showing you one, there's many, of Sherry Levine's iterations of Fountain, an appropriation of Duchamp's work, already appropriated from its intended function as a urinal, in which the elevation of the mundane object to the art object is proclaimed by its material and finish. So sort of Levine purposely wanted to emphasize the way that Duchamp's mundane object had become this revered art object, sort of recognizable, at least in art circles everywhere. And she's also notably part of what was called the Pictures generation, along with Cindy Sherman. So the sort of group of artists in the sort of late 70s and 80s really focusing on sort of plays of identity and sort of appropriation of imagery and sort of turning, changing the reception and perception of the image. And so Levine is well known for these appropriations of celebrated works of art. So Duchamp is definitely not the only artist. There are many, many artists that she's taken their work, whether photographs that are rephotographed or objects, but they take on a new signification when reauthorized by a woman artist, and this is very much her intention. Like Hannah Wilke, Levine attempts to destabilize or at least highlight and challenge the patriarchal authority so entwined with the appreciation and consumption of art. Ironically, Duchamp has become exactly the kind of art world father figure that he would have lampooned himself, I'm sure, even if he also had a really strong hand in securing that legacy, right? He made sure that his works were collected together in sort of key institutions towards the end of his life. Yet, as I hope my talk has suggested, he also helped to open up a new realm of possibility in regards to art and gender. So, for example, who could have imagined, even with all the things I've already showed you, who could have imagined an artist peeing off of the Chrysler Building as a work of art? Yet here we have Janine Antoni, so the same artist who photographed her parents, right, transgressing these different gender roles. So here she is enjoying the male prerogative of peeing while standing up with the help of a copper conduit. She noted in an interview that she had originally imagined the object to be in porcelain, thinking of Duchamp, but eventually settled on copper for its patina and architectural evocations. So she said, well, they say the body is a temple, so here's my body, it's a temple. And what do temples have? Sometimes they have gargoyles. The wind blowing her hair, she says this was sort of fortuitous, into a kind of beard, opened up another set of Duchampian associations as Antoni, in her own words, became half man and half woman. So finally, I couldn't resist finishing off, actually more demure than a lot of things I've shown you so far, finishing with Italian artist Maurizio Cattelan's America, the golden toilet that was most recently brought to the world's attention when the Guggenheim offered it to President Trump in place of a desired loan of a Van Gogh. Yes. Oh, you didn't all know this. I'm glad I'm the one to tell you. As the museum noted, hoping to entice the president, the solid 18-karat gold toilet, quote, beautifully channels the history of 20th century avant-garde art by referencing Marcel Duchamp's famous urinal of 1917. I would also note that it was created 5 years after Cattelan declared himself in retirement. Rather like Duchamp, he evidently couldn't entirely quit the art world. So, although he came back more quickly, Duchamp was more firmly in supposed retirement. So I leave you to decide for yourself whether you would be pleased with such an offer, knowing the illustrious lineage of this golden toilet. Though it may not subvert gender and sexual identity in the way that Duchamp's fountain did, it at least does remind us that regardless of sex or gender, we all need to use the bathroom. So thank you very much.